Good morning. My name is Justin Long. I am the Director of Research for Beyond. I work with the 2414 initiative to document movements around the world and how they are engaging the unreached. Right now, we've documented something on the order of 1,300, 1,400 movements in the world, which represent 76, almost 77 million believers in nearly 5 million churches. So if you saw my other workshop, you'll have a broader understanding of where those movements are and how they're impacting the world. But there are many places that have not yet been touched by any type of team, movement or traditional or otherwise. And one of the goals of the 2414 Coalition, one of the goals of many of the people that are involved in 2414 is to see all of the peoples and all of the places engaged, ideally by movement teams that will rapidly multiply the church amongst those in the gospel amongst those people groups. How do we make plans in a way that we see all of the people groups reached? That's the topic of this particular workshop, which I'm loosely calling coverage planning. How do we look at a country, at a set of provinces, at a set of people groups, and ensure that we have teams that are adequately engaging those places? Even amongst many of the places that are engaged right now, what we see are a few teams engaging very populous people groups. And so, in some respects, we find that these are under engagements. They are not a sufficient level of engagement for the size of the people group or the population that they are working among. So we need to think about how do we adequately saturate these places. Now, the reality is, if you use a movement strategy that scales, you don't need as many cross-cultural workers as you might think, because really one team can engage with a multiplying strategy could engage roughly 100,000 people because the workers are in the harvest. But we still need to find teams and find those population segments and place the teams amongst the segments. So let's talk first about strategic targets and about people groups, right? So there are 5 major sources of people group data. The first one that is most readily accessible and easy to get to is joshuaproject.net. This project has been around for quite some time. It documents all the people groups in the world. It's a wonderfully user-friendly website that has this enormous collection of data on it that's very useful. Finishingthetask.com has a list of what are called UUPGs. This is another website with a list that is loosely based on research from the IMB that is all about which people groups are unengaged. The Ethnologue, which is done by SIL, are lists of languages in each country. So if you're looking for a specific country, you can get that data from the Ethnologue, and it will list all the languages that are involved. Peoplegroups.org comes out of the IMB's Global Research Department, and it's another view of UPGs, unreached groups. And then let me mention in passing the 2 print books, Operation World and the World Christian Encyclopedia. Operation World is a country-by-country survey, and the World Christian Encyclopedia lists all of the countries of the world and all of the denominations of the world and gives you an overview of what's happening in every country. Let's talk about a little bit about the nuances of this data set. People groups. Different databases handle people groups in different ways. So when you look at the different databases, Joshua Project, peoplegroups.org, Finishing the Task, you're going to find some differences in the total number of people groups and which people groups are mentioned. Now, if you look at any given country and you were to compare, say, Joshua Project with peoplegroups.org, you would largely see the same people groups, but there would be some places where they're different. The biggest place where they're different is India. And the reason is that some databases handle India in an ethnic and linguistic form, and some databases like Joshua Project get into the castes within the people groups. So I wouldn't get too distracted by the differences in numbers. You just have to really understand which database you're using and the purpose you're putting it to. It's very useful to have different views of the same data. So you have to keep that in mind. Languages are different from people groups. People groups are generally defined by ethnicity and by the language that they speak. So languages are kind of a bigger subset than people groups. You could have a half dozen different people groups in a particular country that speak the same language, but have different ethnic or social differences amongst them. Uh, Socio-political groups are slices of people groups. So that term is reserved for segments that are inside. So you might have urban Kazakhs versus rural Kazakhs. That's one very simple, rudimentary way of looking at it. Taxi cab drivers, if is another sometimes referred to subset of a people group. College professors, urban middle class. There's various ways of slicing and dicing people groups. Usually, from a strategic perspective, we look at either people groups or languages. But when you begin making ministry plans, you will often look at socio-political slices of a particular people group for the more on the ground ministry aspects. Second nuance that we need to talk about is how these lists define Christian and how they define unreached and unengaged. So remember I said Joshua Project looks at unreached people groups and Finishing the Task looks at unengaged people groups. And if you were to get into it, the World Evangelization Database, World Christian Database that's part of the World Christian Encyclopedia, deals with unevangelized groups. These are three different ways of measuring how needy a particular people group is, how much access they have to the gospel. And there are three different ways of looking at the task. And so just understanding these three different measures gives you three different views. So when we talk about unreached, what we're talking about is a people group where the local church does not have the resources necessary to finish the task on their own, and they really need some cross-cultural outside help. It could be that there is no local church. It could be that the local church is too small versus the size of the people group for them to meaningfully accomplish the task in this generation. There could be a number of different reasons, and people discuss whether a group is unreached or not. Usually the line where a group is no longer considered to be unreached is 5% Christian or 2% evangelical. So that's the unreached groups. It's all about whether the local church can do the job. Unengaged means that there is no local church and there are no teams focused on that people group to even begin the job of bringing the gospel to them. So unengaged is a subset of unreached. It's a really unreached part of the population. It's not only are there no believers, not only is there no church, but the task hasn't even begun. And that was part of the reason why Finishing the Task got started, was to create that list and help people kind of get to the starting line with these particular people groups. They wanted to get the job started in these groups at least, so that the job could continue forward. Unevangelized is a measure of how much access the group has, either from the outside in or from the local church, either way, and is a measure of how much access the entire group has to the gospel. So unreached, unengaged, unevangelized, all of these are driven on the term Christian. And there's two measures in most of the big databases that talk about Christian. One is Christian and one is evangelical. So Christian means Christian in the broadest sense, right? Catholics, Anglicans, Orthodox, Independents, Protestants, everybody. So that's Christianity in its broadest sense. And you'll see some places in the world that are heavily Christian, but it's kind of a cultural Christianity. You'll see some places in the world that are very small percentage Christian, of any variety whatsoever. Evangelical is the more traditional Western definition of evangelical, which just means it's trying to get to the idea of a born again believer or a Great Commission Christian. Those terms have been used sometimes, but basically evangelical believers. And that is a subset, of course, of Christian. So most of the time, as I said, when you're looking at unreached, the line is 5% Christian and or 2% evangelical. There can be times when a group is heavily Christian and a low percent evangelical, but amongst unreached groups, you're usually not going to find any time where you have you'll never find evangelicals higher than Christians, obviously, and rare amongst unreached groups will you find that evangelicals are like 0 and Christians are 5%. Usually they go hand in hand. Okay, let's talk about places. So now we're going to drill down a little bit deeper into how do we make sure all of the places are covered. So when we start to talk about places as opposed to people groups, again, we need some lists. And the country list, there's a definitive list from the United Nations, but of course, the UN doesn't recognize all the countries in the world. So now we start to get into some of the complexities of things. So usually any given country list is about 240, 245 countries, and it'll be the UN countries, maybe plus a few others that the UN doesn't necessarily recognize. So for example, my own list includes Palestine and Taiwan amongst others. Then for provinces, so if you look at India, right? India is 1.2 or 1.4 billion people. You can't obviously target all of India. You need to start breaking down, well, where in India are you going to be focused? Some places within India are more reached, and some places within India are less reached. So now we get to the province level. So how do we get to the province level? Province lists are a little harder to come by. Once upon a time, there was a website called Statoids. Unfortunately, it was maintained by a lone researcher who recently passed away. And so that website is in flux at the moment. Other places you can find province lists are censuses. You can find them on Wikipedia. I have a database myself of provinces, which if somebody's interested in that, I can make that available. But the provinces sometimes change, and getting a list of provinces for the whole world is a challenge. It's a lot easier to get a province list for a particular country than it is to get all of the provinces around the world. So my recommendation is usually people find the country or countries that you're going to be focused on, and then work on getting the province lists for those. It's fairly easy to do that. Censuses will often break out populations by province. That will give you the population data as well. And it's important to know just how big of a population that you're dealing with. Uttar Pradesh, for example, is nearly as populous as the United States. So now we need to go perhaps one step further into this and look at districts. Generally speaking, we found that a movement team can target, can focus on about 100,000 people. So we need to break this down into population segments that are somewhere on the order of around 100,000, 200,000 people. And oftentimes we can do that by getting down to the district level. Some countries, the provinces are at that level, but most countries, it's the district level, the districts or counties or subsections of a particular province. Districts are difficult to get to. Some places you'll find district lists in the censuses, some places you won't. Also, district lists change. People are constantly redrawing political borders. They do this for a variety of reasons. They do this because some districts become more populous and they need to be broken up into smaller districts in order to be more manageable. They may decide to completely redraw the districts because of the politics involved. They may decide to redraw districts to simplify because they've gotten too complex. There's a variety of reasons. Knowing the place where you're going to minister at the very outset means knowing the districts within the province. This is where you start to really understand the nuances and characteristics and traits of the places that you're working. Some of these districts will be heavily urban. Some of these districts will be rural and agricultural and agrarian. Some of these districts will be highly educated or secularized or one particular religion. Others will be another religion, or they might be less secularized and more religious, or they might have pilgrimage sites or all sorts of different things. So understanding these districts is really key to understanding what the remaining task in a place is. In a few places, I'm thinking mostly of China right now. In a few places, in order to get to 100,000 population segments, you need to go underneath the districts into sub-districts. That's less common, but that does happen sometimes. Also, a fourth kind of place is the city. So cities often are done at a province or district level. In other words, you might have a city like where I live in Texas in the United States. I live in Dallas. So the city of Dallas, actually there are there's a county that encompasses the city, and the county is the district level. So you will find when you break down to the district level, you'll find some of those districts are actually cities and urban areas, and that's one way of getting to the cities. In other places, you might have more than one city in a particular district, and you might need a list of the cities because the cities are agglomerations of people groups that require unique strategies. So let's talk about what we need to collect at the city level, at the place level. Aside from things like population, trying to figure out percent Christian, which really drives the unreached, unevangelized. When you look at all of the measures of the remaining task, unreached, unevangelized, unengaged, for all of them, by large, the biggest component is percent Christian. It's how Christian is this place. So while you might not know specifically whether a place is unreached or unengaged or unevangelized, you'll get 70% of the way to the answer to that question by knowing what percent Christian or how Christian the place is. Now, if you look at countries, percent Christian is pretty well defined. You can get that data off of Joshua Project. So there's a lot of researchers that focus on figuring out percent Christian for every country in the world. Once you start getting into provinces and districts, that data gets a lot rougher. Districts, it's rarely known the exact percent Christian. Provinces, it's a very rough approximation. So how do you figure this out? I would suggest to you that in trying to make closure plans, the best thing to do is create a list of the countries that you're operating in, a list of the provinces that are in those countries that you're going to focus on, and a list of the districts within those provinces. And then for every province or district, your research, your data collection, your understanding of that place needs to focus on a scale. And I use a scale from 0 to 5. I can't estimate for any given place whether it is exactly, 3% Christian or, 4.82% Christian. That's nearly impossible at the province or district level. But you can fairly well figure out whether a place is, say, under 2% Christian or over 2% Christian. You can know whether a place is, very unreached, under 2%, or, moderately reached, over 32% Christian, over a third Christian. You can see the churches, the visible churches. You get a sense for the believers, and you might not know the exact percentage, but it's good enough to have a rule of thumb estimate. So I use this scale, which I'm showing on this slide. 0 is really, really unreached, less than 0.1% Christian, or one believer in every 1,000 people. 1 is less than 2% Christian. This fits the typical unreached definition. 2 is less than 8% Christian. And you'll notice these scales, they double each time. They double twice. So from 2 to 8 to 32 to over 32%, but less than 90% Christian, which is a lot of the more Christian provinces around the world. And then 5, which is over 90% Christian, which means basically a kind of cultural Christianity that's really soaked in. I find these 6 components, 0 to 5, are the major strategic definitions, segments that you have to focus on. These determine strategy. So how you operate in a scale 0 province is going to be different from how you operate in a scale 1 or 2 or 3 province, right? So really, this is pretty much what you need to know. So it's easy to, to go through a district list and be able, based on your knowledge that you accumulate over time, you'll be able to say, this is a level 0, this is a level 2. You don't really need to know, this is 3 or 4 or 6.875%. That's just not necessary. I'm also including here the CPM continuum scale, which we use in measuring movements. I find this is a really good way of looking at how much engagement there is in a particular area, especially from a movement perspective. You could use something similar to this. So not only could you say the scale of reach into the scale of Christianity in a particular province, you could also track which ones you've engaged and where you're seeing fruit. So you can measure those two over time. So let's talk about coverage planning. I just go for a very simple, straightforward approach. You don't have to know everything. You just need to know enough to determine where you go next. A lot of times people envision research as being this, like I have a big building and I've got a staff of hundreds and we're getting reports from all over the world, live on our cell phones and people are reporting all the time. That's not how global research works. That's not how missions research really, really works. People would like it to work that way, but for a variety of reasons, from security to relationships to other things, it doesn't work that way. People envision missions research and planning and strategy. My mentor, David Barrett, told me like a black and white photograph. A picture of an unreached place looks like a black and white photograph, high resolution. You can blow it up. You can see the pixels of the person's skin and everything, hair, whatnot. Dr. Barrett told me once upon a time, missions research isn't like that. It's more like a Monet painting. I don't know if you've ever seen a Monet painting, but they're very fuzzy. They're kind of blurry. They're done with little points and squares and dots, and they're fuzzy, he said, but they're recognizable. And that's what missions research really is. It's fuzzy. It's not highly detailed. It's fuzzy, but it's recognizable, and it's enough for us to figure out where we need to go next. So I start with a simple spreadsheet. List of the countries, list of the provinces, lists of the districts. For those countries, provinces, districts, I like to try to find 2 population data points. That tells me how fast the population is growing, and I know that my effort needs to be faster than the population growth if I want percent Christian to go up. So I try to find 2 population data points. For provinces, this normally comes from censuses. If censuses have been held at the UN level, there's UN population data that you can get a hold of. At the district level, it's very, very difficult to find 2 population data points, admittedly. So in some places, you have to kind of estimate as much population data as you can get to give you that population growth. It's nice if you can find it, and sometimes you can, using Wikipedia and other sources, to find the square kilometers or the square feet associated with a particular place, because that gives you density, right? So population divided by square kilometers gives you person per square kilometer, and the higher density places are urban. The lower density places are more rural, and those determine 2 different kinds of strategies. That doesn't mean that a high density place is automatically a city, but it does give you an indicator, a pretty quick indicator that that's the case. Also, as I mentioned, for every province, for every city, a scaled estimate of the percent Christian for those places, and then is their engagement, ideally with the DMM team. So that's the place list. You start with that. Then for each of those places, I would suggest in your research identifying the scale of language complexity in that place. So the question becomes, 1, is it over 90% one particular language? There are provinces in the world where basically they only speak one language. That's it. And so your strategy can be informed by that. You only have to worry about that language, right? 2, it's a place where there's majority one language, but there is a significant minority of smaller languages. Now you have to have a multilingual approach, because yes, it's okay to reach that big language, and you should reach that big language, but you also need to make sure that these smaller languages are being touched as well. Now, here's one thing. In several countries, particularly in Southeast Asia, we've focused a lot on the minority languages, and we've not served the majority language as well. So it's not always that the big language gets all the attention and the little languages have the barriers. It can be the other way around. We need to make sure that in any given province, in any given district, that there are no gaps, that everybody gets to hear the gospel. And that means looking at the languages that are involved. So we need to make sure that all of these languages are being addressed. Third category is a wide variety of languages spoken. This is especially true of cities. You'll find in cities, there's often this mishmash of various languages. You'll find some parts of cities are one language, some parts of cities are another language. Sometimes there's blurring and blending. Sometimes there's trade languages. It's a very difficult thing. So in cities, we tend to track less by language and more by area of the city that's being impacted. Um, and the rule of thumb that I use in all of these places is, to a certain extent, let the language determine where you go. So if you're focused on a particular people group or a language, that will determine where you go. But once you're there, reach everybody in the place. Build a strategy that focuses on reaching everyone in the place. If we did that, then we would cover everybody and not have these gaps. So one, for a scale of language complexity, one means vast majority, if not everybody, speaks one language. Two means a majority one language with some minority languages. And three means a wide mishmash of languages are being spoken. Then the next trick is to identify the languages that are being spoken. And here, I don't think you need to get down to the very smallest languages. Like, there are some languages in the world that are spoken by 10 or 20 or 30 people at this point. There are some languages in the world that are dying. But you need to have an understanding of the linguistic complexity of a particular place and identify those languages that are being spoken. So start by identifying the major language that's in any given province, district, city, and then identify all of the larger languages. Say, start identifying the ones that are spoken by more than 1% or more than 10% of the province or the district. And then you might begin to look at the languages in a country that are spoken by more than 1% of the country, because those might be dispersed over the provinces. They may not make up huge components of the country in any individual place, and yet there's a significant percentage of the country as a whole. So you need to know basically where those smaller 1%, 5% languages, where they're located, where their centers are, so that you make sure that those are being engaged as well. So a lot of this is just kind of working your way down through the language lists. Again, I don't think, I realize this might sound a little missiologically heretical, if you will. I don't think every last language needs to have its own scripture, its own team, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Many of these small languages also speak trade languages, and they're perfectly functional in those trade languages, and it's okay to reach them that way. The question is not, do we have a linguistic approach for every language? The question is does every individual have a chance to hear the gospel in a way that they understand? Right? It's all about the individual, not about the language. The reason that we're concerned about languages and places is because there are gaps. There are places where people are cut off because of the language that they speak or the place that they speak. But we're concerned about the people who are cut off, not just about checking off boxes on a language list. So let's figure out the best way to identify where the gaps are, and then let's reach those gaps. Let's fill those gaps with the gospel so that, the glory of the Lord can cover the earth like the waters cover the sea. So languages that comprise over 1% of the population, and then look for small languages that are not bilingual in trade languages, small languages that represent gaps. And also we need to look for diaspora peoples. Now, the diaspora peoples don't always appear on our people group lists or on our language lists, because they're very small groupings and they may be in major cities. So because they're in flux all the time, because some of them are leaving and some of them are coming, and it changes with the political situation. COVID-19, for example, has seen a lot of changes in the diaspora peoples. People have been repatriated. People have gone home. Other people have been stuck where they are. So we have these various things happening, and they happen too fast to capture them in the major people group lists. Understanding the mix and the makeup of diaspora peoples, especially in the major cities and in the major economic areas, is an important part of this overarching task. And it's a gap that can sometimes appear and we don't notice it because it's not on the big lists. So really, that's the end of coverage planning. A lot of this is just very simply identifying the places, identifying the peoples in those places. My colleague, Dr. Samuel, is going to have a great presentation. I've seen parts of it already, where he talks about how they actually did this on the field. And I hope that you will check out his presentation, because he'll get into the nuts and bolts of how they actually did this and walk you through some of that. In the meantime, if you have any questions about this, or if I could help you in any way with list building or coverage planning, please don't hesitate to drop me an email. My email address is on the PowerPoint. Thank you.